Hello, this is Dr. S. Mocker, and welcome to today's discussion of the Gilded Age. So, on today's recording, we are going to be talking about the period in the United States from the 1870s to the 1890s. That was a time period we tend to remember as very prosperous, where people made a lot of money, had a lot of wealth. But as the word gilded means, as we'll talk about in just a second, that's not the case for everyone, that there is more going on underneath the surface. So, to give two examples of the reality of life in the Gilded Age, let's first look at an estate in Asheville, North Carolina called Biltmore. So Biltmore was built by George Washington Vanderbilt II, who was a member of the very prominent and wealthy Vanderbilt family between 1889 and 1895. It still holds the record today as the largest privately owned house in the United States, with about 178,926 square feet. Yes, that is a lot of house. You can today go and visit the Biltmore estate. They sell tickets. They have extensive grounds, including gardens. It's on a very impressive amount of acreage. Today, Biltmore estate is actually much smaller than it once was, because a lot of the forest land that Vanderbilt cultivated and turned into a fledgling forestry school was eventually donated to the public trust. But the estate grounds, the landscaping that the estate proper sits on, was designed by Frederick Law Olmsted, who was probably today is best known for designing Central Park in New York City. The Biltmore estate is full of classic examples of European antiques and salvaged goods. It was very common practice for wealthy American elites to take long trips to Europe and to bring back art, rare books, and other things. And in particular, George Vanderbilt really loved collecting books. And so he built this very splendid and massive library. It was 2 stories high in this massive room. It's a dream if you're a book lover, for sure, and it's one of the highlights of the Biltmore estate. So while the Vanderbilt family enjoyed this massive countryside estate in the mountains of North Carolina, very few people in reality got to enjoy life on this scale. In particular, the vast majority of Americans belonged to what we would call the working class. These were people who did not enjoy a great level of wealth. In fact, many of them actively struggled with poverty and homelessness. This is also a time period where, unlike today, where we have labor laws that regulate things like unemployment or workers' compensation or even child labor, none of these laws yet exist. There's no laws on workplace safety. There's no laws on minimum wage or maximum working hours. None of that exists as of the time at the Gilded Age. So the reality for the working class in the Gilded Age was very precarious. They did not get to enjoy the level of luxury of the families like the Vanderbilts, who had made quite a tidy profit in areas of American industry. So the word gilded means covered in gold or with a fine plating of gold. And this term comes from a novel by Mark Twain and Charles Dudley Warner, which was a satirical novel published in 1873, poking fun at American society during the Gilded Age. Twain and Warner were making the argument that American society, American politics in particular, the elite class of Americans, were hypocritical and corrupt. And the Gilded Age, again, when you look at estates like Biltmore, seems very glamorous on the surface, but when you investigate underneath, you'll see that it's not solid gold all the way through, that there's a lot of inequality and a lot of problems. A lot of this inequality stems from a boom in American economy known as the Second Industrial Revolution. So the First Industrial Revolution we talk about in the first half of American history classes usually. The First Industrial Revolution took place at the end of the 1700s and beginning of the 1800s and gave us innovations like factories and railroads, canals, steam engines, which powered all kinds of devices, including steam ships. The Second Industrial Revolution, which takes place in the late 1800s, builds on these earlier innovations. So we see an increasing level of industrialization or mechanization of manufacturing. We see more rapid urbanization, or people moving into cities primarily for work opportunities in the manufacturing sector. We see increasing levels of technological innovation, in many cases building on or improving technologies invented during the First Industrial Revolution. And we also see a huge growth in the American economy. And for the first time, we can actually start to talk about a truly national economy in the United States, thanks to innovations in communication and transportation. During the Second Industrial Revolution, there was much more rapid and thorough industrialization than ever before. We see more industries embracing mass production methods. The First Industrial Revolution had seen specific industries like the textile industry really embracing machines to replace human hand labor. And now we're starting to see this level of mechanization spread into other industries. We also see a shift in where manufacturing is headquartered. In the First Industrial Revolution, a lot of manufacturing is centered on places like New England. Now we start to see a shift towards cities in what today is known as the American Midwest. So cities like Detroit, Pittsburgh, and Chicago become known for manufacturing and steel production during the Gilded Age. Chicago actually becomes the second largest city in the United States by 1900 with 1.7 million people. That's not bad from a city that actually started as a very small village at the side of Lake Michigan only several decades before. There's an increasing shift in how Americans work. More and more Americans are working outside of the agricultural sector. By 1880, the majority of people are actually, for the first time, working outside of farming. By 1890, 2/3 of workers worked for wages rather than being self-employed, which again was a shift in the American economy. And about 11 million Americans moved from rural areas into cities between 1870 and 1920. The working class also significantly changes. One of the reasons for this change is a boom in migration. We start to see 25 million immigrants come to the United States between 1870 and 1920. And the growth of large-scale factories and mechanized production meant that more and more workers were working for large corporations of about 250 or more employees and didn't know everybody that they were working with, which again was a marked shift from earlier patterns of labor. Technological innovations during the Second Industrial Revolution helped to speed up communication, to create the foundations of life as we know and enjoy today, and also to revolutionize transportation. The telegraph, which had been invented by Samuel Morse during the First Industrial Revolution, is extended during the Gilded Age. Especially important to this extension is the laying of the transatlantic cable on the seafloor in 1866, which finally connected Europe and the United States for the first time with near instantaneous communication. We also see the introduction in the Gilded Age of the telephone, invented by Alexander Graham Bell, and the typewriter. Both of these innovations helped speed up communication and make it more accessible. For example, the telegraph, while a great invention, did not really lend itself easily to use because you had to learn a special code, Morse code, to be able to communicate with the telegraph and have to set up bulky equipment. There's no such user entry into the telephone. You pick it up and you talk. And so the telephone becomes household technology in a way that the telegraph never could because of its easier accessibility and usage. Similarly, the typewriter and the speed of mechanical communication introduced during the Gilded Age helped drastically improve efficiency and speed of communication for American businesses in particular. One of the most revolutionary inventions during the Gilded Age is the harnessing of electricity. And we tend to associate electricity, particularly the light bulb and the use of electric lights, with Thomas Edison, an inventor who maintained a laboratory in Menlo Park, New Jersey, which basically became turned out hit after hit out of his laboratory. He employed a small army of engineers and inventors and patented many of the inventions coming out of his lab. In addition to the light bulb, Edison also introduced and patented early forms of the phonograph, or the ancestor of the record player, the motion picture or film, movies, and the first commercially viable electric generator. But Edison is not the only innovator when it comes to electricity. Edison was in fact in constant competition with another inventor named Nikola Tesla. Edison and Tesla both competed with each other on what they felt was the superior version of electricity. Edison proposed a direct current usage of electricity, whereas Tesla proposed a rival alternate current. In order to demonstrate that their particular version of harnessing electricity was better, Edison and Tesla and their supporters staged numerous demonstrations of how unsafe the other's electricity form was, and probably one of the most notable of these demonstrations involved purposely electrocuting animals, which today would not fly because of animal cruelty laws. And the most notable animal who suffered from a demonstration like this was actually an elephant named Topsy. If you want to know more about Topsy, I highly recommend either watching Drunk History, which did a segment on Topsy, or watching, if you're a fan of Bob's Burgers, the episode Electric Love, in which the kids stage a musical version of Topsy's story. When it comes to transportation, during the Gilded Age, we see railroads really blossom. Railroads had been introduced prior to the Civil War as part of the First Industrial Revolution, but they had been limited in potential, partly because railroad construction was not even across all of the United States, with most of the rail line in the United States being in the Northeast prior to the Civil War. And the other problem with railroads before the Civil War was that there was no standard gauge, or in other words, width of the tracks. And so you basically had to wholesale change train cars depending upon what section of rail you were riding, which makes it very difficult to transport people and goods if you're constantly having to unload and reload to a different train car. So rail gauge, or width of the rails, are standardized following the Civil War, and we start to see a construction boom of railroads. By 1900, there are about 200,000 miles of railroad nationwide. And the railroad building boom, which included the first transcontinental railroad in the United States, connecting the East Coast from the West Coast continuously, really supported growth in related areas of the economy. For example, you needed steel to be able to produce these rails and train cars, and you also needed coal to power the steam engines that made the railroads go. So because of this, we start to see large corporations or companies rise in the United States because railroads are complicated business. As you can see, we go from about 31,000 miles of railroad before the Civil War, again, mostly concentrated in the Northeast, to much more equitable, although not perfect, distribution of 200,000 miles of railroad by 1900. So this explosive growth meant railroad companies in particular became very large and very difficult to manage. Railroads literally shrank space and time. More land was cleared to allow for the development of railroad, but also building railroads made land, especially in the West, more accessible to further settlement, which unfortunately led to further displacement of indigenous tribes and more levels of environmental damage. But railroads also shrunk our conception of distance and time by now us measuring how far away something is. We tend to measure it more in terms of how long it would take us to get there than the actual physical distance. So for example, you might say, I commute 45 minutes to work and not, 30 miles to work, for example. It also literally changes our understanding of time because railroads had to standardize time to, number one, have consistent transportation schedules posted for their customers. Number two, to avoid catastrophic disaster. Prior to this, there was no standardization of time. Most cities and towns measured time approximately by the sun, which meant you could have a difference in time between cities that today are in the same time zone of 7 minutes. Which doesn't sound bad unless you realize that you have these huge trains coming in, and if you are off on the schedule, you can end up having a very catastrophic collision that could result in the loss of life and property. So railroad companies became the first ones to standardize time in 1883, dividing the United States into 4 uniform time zones to allow for better train scheduling. Because of the centrality of trains for transporting people and goods in the United States, most people tended to adopt this change in how time was measured. And the US government formally recognizes this system of time zones in 1918, following enthusiastic local adoption of standardized time. Railroads, in connecting the United States, also enabled for the first time a truly national economy. Prior to this, the United States had been a series of local and increasingly larger regional societies, but now railroads literally connected coast to coast. We start to see the emergence of truly national brands for the first time. So firms like A&P, or the Atlantic and Pacific Tea Company, Montgomery Ward, and Sears Roebuck and Company established presences nationwide, putting stores throughout the United States. Sears in particular would be the Gilded Age equivalent of what Amazon is today. You could literally order anything you could think of from the Sears catalog, including your home. Yes, you could buy your entire house from Sears. You could shop in the catalog for a floor plan that you liked. And if you purchased it, not only would they send you the blueprints and the instructions for building, but all the materials as well that would be shipped conveniently to the location that you requested. So Sears, although today, as of this recording in 2021, is not doing so well, really they were as predominant in the Gilded Age economy as, again, Amazon as a website is in 2021. We also see, with advances in communication, more forays into advertising. In particular, this helps us to create national brands like Quaker Oats, which are marketed and sold across the United States. With the emergence of national chains and national companies and products, we now see the development of new corporations, particularly incredibly large scale and complex corporations. These large scale corporations were better able to survive worldwide economic downturns. And as we're going to see during the Gilded Age, there's a series of spikes and dips in the economy, a series of very prosperous time periods, and then economic panics and depressions. And so the larger a company was, the more likely it was to be able to sustain itself in economic downturn. But we also start to see some business practices that would not fly today because of legal changes that these Gilded Age corporations pursued in the name of survival. The men running these large corporations are very skilled individuals. And depending upon your perspective of them, they can have the nicknames either captains of industry, which really emphasize the cunning, the smarts needed to build up these large corporations, in some cases from the ground up, from nothing. Or if you have a more negative viewpoint of these capitalists and argued that they exploited the workers and engaged in some shady tactics to get to the top, then you can call them the nickname the robber barons. The capitalists behind these increasingly large corporations often engaged in very cutthroat activities to gain the advantage in industry, or sometimes colluded or cooperated with each other to fix prices. Many of these Gilded Age capitalists, these big names in Gilded Age business, started from humble beginnings and had either made or increased their fortunes during the Civil War, oftentimes through government contracts with the Union. There's no corporate income taxes at this time, and no personal income tax during the Gilded Age either. So this meant that people who were wealthy during this time period were very, very wealthy because there's no taxes they have to pay on their business or their personal lives. Many of these wealthy capitalists during the Gilded Age not only used their wealth to live lives of luxury and comfort, like we talked about with the Vanderbilts and Biltmore, but also engaged in charity work with their money. Probably the two biggest titans of the Gilded Age are John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie. John D. Rockefeller established Standard Oil, which had a near total monopoly on the oil supply in the United States. Rockefeller had started as a clerk in one of his brother's firms. And then Andrew Carnegie established a similar empire in the steel industry. Carnegie had immigrated from Scotland as a child to the United States and got his start as a teenager working in a textile factory. So both Rockefeller and Carnegie started from very humble backgrounds, and through a combination of luck, determination, and skill and hard work, were able to build their businesses into full-fledged monopolies. Now, there's a number of different ways in which businesses sought to have the best competitive edge during the Gilded Age. In one, there's a level of cooperation. Corporations benefit from a certain degree of cooperation with each other. For example, pools divided the market between competitors, ensuring that they did not compete directly against each other. So for an example of a pool, imagine, say, two rival grocery store chains divide up the United States. So, okay, west of the Mississippi, that's going to be your turf, your domain. East of the Mississippi is ours. And that way you never have to directly compete. There's also trusts, which are a type of merger without officially merging companies. Trusts are where you hire a single director of operations to run multiple officially unrelated companies. So again, the idea is because you have one dude running multiple companies, that therefore you avoid damaging competition. Then there's also just outright the practice of mergers, of corporations buying smaller competitors in order to reduce competition. Between 1897 and 1904, 4,000 firms were absorbed by larger companies in this bid to reduce competition. And one of the largest of these mergers creates U.S. Steel, which was a combination of 8 large steel companies created by J.P. Morgan in 1901. The ultimate goal for a lot of these corporations was to establish a monopoly in their particular industries. Now, when you hear monopoly, you're probably thinking about that board game that your parents banned you from playing with your siblings because somebody got too competitive when you were a kid. At least that's what happened in my family. But monopoly in the business sense means that one entity completely controls the market in their particular product or service. And the reason that monopolies are desirable for businesses is it eliminates competition. And competition tends to do 2 things. Number one, competition tends to drive prices lower as you're competing for market share. You want to make your product look desirable to consumers by making it cheaper. The other thing that competition tends to do is it does tend to drive more money into research and development, as again, the other way you want to try to compete for consumers is to have the better product. So businesses generally don't like competition because of those 2 reasons. They cost them more money. They make the profit margins slimmer. So many businesses wanted to eliminate competition so they could dictate prices and basically make it so that consumers had no alternate options but them. There are 2 different ways that you could organize monopolies. The first is by a different kind of trust, not the same as the one I just mentioned, but this is an example of vertically arranging a monopoly. In the case of a vertical monopoly, you want to control all aspects of production so you can control price and distribution. So this means, let's say you're a car company, you want to not only control the manufacturing of the car, but everything from the raw material, including growing or producing the rubber for your tires and all the other raw material going into the actual manufacturing, all the way to the end of the distribution process where you and not middlemen are selling the product. So this means you can control costs at every level of production and distribution. So the classic example of this during the Gilded Age is John D. Rockefeller's Standard Oil, which controlled 90%, 90, of the U.S. oil industry by the 1880s. The other example of monopoly, one that's probably easier to obtain, is a horizontal organization. And the classic example of that in business, and note I mean business, not necessarily just legitimate business, is cartels. Distribution is the easiest part of the process to control if you're going to establish a horizontal monopoly. So if you're the only person who is producing this desirable product, that means that you can dictate the price and better regulate the market. So drug cartels would be an example of this. Again, notice I mentioned we're not always talking about legal markets. The problem with monopolies is that they work for businesses, but they don't work very well for consumers. You as the consumer end up having to pay higher prices and oftentimes get inferior products because there's no competition to encourage innovation or to encourage competitive prices. And so there begins to be some concern by the end of the Gilded Age from citizens about a lack of regulation of U.S. corporations and how it was harmful to American consumers. Now, when we look away from the captains of industry, or robber barons if you'd prefer, and look at the people actually doing the work on the ground, the working class, The second industrial revolution does create some opportunities for skilled workers. If you were a worker whose skill set could not be easily translated into a machine, then you enjoyed a great deal of authority in your job because you couldn't be as easily replaced. This gave you a certain degree of freedom and self-supervision in areas like your pace of work, what you could reasonably be expected to produce, and also in training new skilled workers. So skilled workers benefited because, again, they were occupying positions that could not as easily be translated into machine labor. Because of that, though, skilled workers are a very small portion of the industrial workforce as more and more innovations and mechanization are taking away jobs that were previously done by skilled workers by hand. So the vast majority of the workforce is actually not as skilled. They're either unskilled or semi-skilled. The average worker had almost no guarantee of job security. Sometimes corporations, to save money, if there was an economic downturn, simply shut down production at a factory and you were out of a job and there was no kind of compensation, no unemployment benefits. There's no, as I mentioned, no compensation if you are injured or killed on the job, no time off if you're sick. The average worker lived in a constant struggle to stay above the poverty line. Many men during the Gilded Age lived very nomadic lives, looking to find work wherever they could. And many women and children had to go to work as well because it was almost impossible for a member of the working class to be able to make enough money to sustain their family. So everyone in the family had to go to work to survive. The average work week for industrial workers during the Gilded Age is about 60 hours a week, often worked as 12-hour shifts. Now, this much work is, again, very dangerous because you're working a lot of hours in very physically demanding jobs, but there is, again, no safety regulations in the workplace at this time. Between 1880 and 1900, over 35,000 workers were killed on the job every year. If you died on the job, there was nothing that the company owed your family as survivors. Workers labored in factory regardless of age or gender, with women and children being paid less than men because they were seen as not needing as much money, because the idea was still that men should be the primary breadwinner. So the working class is getting poorer at the same time as the rich are getting richer. And so we have an increasing gap in wealth in the United States. In 1890, the top 1% of Americans earned the same as the bottom 50% combined. And the top 1% of Americans owned more property in the United States than the remaining 99% of Americans combined. The upper class also during this time period increasingly focused on conspicuous consumption as a way to symbolize their wealth and status. When we say conspicuous consumption, we mean buying big houses, buying luxury products, taking elaborate vacations as a way to symbolize to the world that you'd made it and that you had a good life. Now, during the Gilded Age, not as many people are focused on the working class, but as we get to the end of the Gilded Age, we do start to see people expressing concern at this huge gap between the rich and poor in the United States. One of these people is Jacob Riis, who is an immigrant from Denmark. Riis was a journalist, and he decided to try to highlight the awful conditions for the working class, particularly in New York City. Riis publishes a book called How the Other Half Lives in 1890, which is basically made up of photos, because he took cameras with him, of tenements or these rickety apartment buildings where working class people lived. He took pictures of working conditions at these factories and sweatshops, and he also interviewed people from the working class about their lives. You can find Jacob Riss's book online because it is no longer copyrighted. You can read it in its entirety at websites like the Gutenberg Project. I believe it has it. And Riss's book was trying to bring attention to the plight of the working class because elite Americans or even middle-class Americans didn't work or live in the same places as these people. And so they didn't experience this firsthand. So Riss was trying to publicize just how awful life was for the working class. He's a little ahead of his time. After the Gilded Age, we will see the rise of the progressive era in which people will be very interested in reform and in trying to improve life for the working class. Riss is kind of on the early cutting edge of that desire to reform. Now, one of the things that the satirical novel by Twain and Warner, The Gilded Age, focused on was on the amount of corruption in the Gilded Age, particularly in business and politics. And money in politics during the Gilded Age was a huge problem. There were a lot of lobbyists from different industries that mobbed not only the national legislature, Congress, but also state level legislatures, trying to get government to favor their corporations. And in particular, the railroad lobby was very, very powerful, oftentimes nicknamed the third house in terms of the power it wielded in state level legislatures. And when lobbying didn't work, there was also straight out kickbacks or money or benefits given to politicians who supported legislation that businesses wanted. Many lawmakers invested in corporations and then used their political clout to get a profit from those investments. And in one case, one notable case, the Union Pacific Railroad formed a shell corporation called Credit Mobilier to form the go-between for government contracts, allowing them to enrich themselves. And to avoid getting caught, they gifted stock to powerful politicians in the hopes that they would keep quiet and benefit. One of the more notorious examples of money and corruption in politics at the national level was the whiskey ring, which was an example of corruption from Ulysses S. Grant's administration. Ulysses S. Grant, as a president, had a terrible track record of appointing good people to his cabinet and other levels of government. And so very high level of corruption during Grant's administration. And the whiskey ring was a very elaborate scheme involving tax collectors, office holders, and whiskey manufacturers that defrauded the federal government of millions of dollars. At the local level, we also see corruption in politics with the emergence of machine politics. So when we're talking about machine politics, what we mean is a political operation usually set in an urban area. And these operations are affiliated with specific political parties. Because we're talking about cities during the Gilded Age, this is usually going to be the Democratic Party. So in this arrangement, political parties would set up shop in neighborhoods, particularly working class neighborhoods, and try to gain support from these working class voters by promising that if they supported the political party of the machine, that they would be given jobs and charity. Now, charity sounds like a weird thing to give, but remember, we don't have a system of Social Security or any other government welfare during the Gilded Age. There's nothing. There's no social safety net. So someone promising to take care of you if you're hungry or you're homeless is a pretty powerful motivator. And so machine politics operated for decades as the primary movers and shakers in urban politics. One of the most powerful examples of this was William Boss Tweed, who led a machine in New York City. And Tweed's reign as kind of the king of New York politics, and in particular Tammany Hall, ends only because politicians and businessmen grew tired of paying Tweed to roll out the vote. In other words, he became too expensive, and they decided just to cut their losses and force him out. So money in politics is there at every level. It's there trying to bribe elected officials to pass legislations that businesses want. It's there at the local level trying to get votes for political parties by bribing poor people with things like food or work. And so it's ever present in Gilded Age politics. Now, when it comes to government and the economy, for the most part, the government during the Gilded Age is not very concerned with regulating business. For them, they're more looking at things like protecting American business. So one is the issue of a tariff. A tariff is a tax on imported products. And usually tariffs are put into place in an effort to give a competitive advantage to domestic manufacturers whose products do not have to have this extra tax put on them. So there's a divide in the American government over should we have a tariff, and if so, how much? The Republican Party during the Gilded Age, which is the party most associated with big business, supported a tariff, arguing that it would help American manufacturers, whereas the Democratic Party was less likely to support a high tariff because, again, the costs would be passed on to consumers. There's also the concern of economic recovery after the American Civil War. In particular, war is always very expensive. And so there's a discussion over currency. And the federal government actively tried to withdraw greenbacks, or paper currency issued directly by the national government during the Civil War. They tried to get those back out of circulation to help stable the nation's finances and get out of debt. This angers farmers and other people of the working class because this means rising inflation and removing money from circulation. The other thing that is introduced to try to stabilize the American dollar and the economy is introducing the gold standard, meaning that currency, paper currency in particular, had to be directly have its value pinned to hard cash, in this case, gold in particular, the value of gold. The people who tend to benefit from things like putting currency in a gold standard and having a tariff are, again, businesses and the elite, because it not only protects businesses and makes them more competitive against potentially cheaper imported products, but also people of the elite could more afford to be able to pay higher values for things because they had money. Now, as we're getting towards the end of the Gilded Age, there is starting to be a little bit of pushback, mostly at the state and local level, to the levels of political corruption, but also to this government economic policy that favored businesses and the elite. We start to see state governments expanding after the Civil War, many of them moving to provide higher levels of public services and public works to their citizens. We see state governments, especially in Reconstruction era South in the 1870s, building schools, prisons, and other infrastructure projects like railroads. We also start to see the rise of grassroots political parties at the state and local level. For example, the Greenback Labor Party was a blend of pro-union working class people in urban areas and rural farmers, which their political platform reflected that by arguing for workplace reforms to make the workplace safer and to compensate workers with higher wages, but also to reintroduce more paper currency, which would help out farmers. While the Greenback Labor Party had some success at state level, they were always a minor political party during the 1870s. We also see extra political organizations, or organizations that are more focused on social issues but do have political agendas, like the Grange, which was a fraternal order of farmers first established in 1867, which was designed to be more of a social order, but they did advocate politically. They agitated for more regulation of railroads, particularly in prices for transporting products, which were really important for farmers living out west. And they also lobbied legislatures to try to control supply, to stabilize the price of agricultural products. And they also tried to set a cap on how much railroads could charge for transporting products. So there is this sense of pushback, especially from farmers during the Gilded Age, but it doesn't really go very far. The very beginnings of reform in the Gilded Age we start to see come about in the 1880s. And again, when we're talking about reform, these are really baby steps compared to the next big era of American history, the Progressive Era. In an attempt to listen to the concerns primarily of farmers who were complaining about price gouging from railroads, Congress establishes the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1887, which was designed to oversee railroad pricing. The problem was that the ICC, for short, could only sue railroads if they were price gouging, but they could not actually set prices. So in reality, it looks good on paper. Okay, fine, we're going to regulate the railroads, but then they don't really have any power given to them to effectively do so. How can you prove that somebody's price gouging if everybody's price gouging, right? So then you can't really single out one company for punishment, for example. We also have the passage of the Civil Service Act in 1883, which is designed to try to minimize corruption in politics. And this was passed partly as a response to the assassination of President James A. Garfield by an individual who was upset that he didn't get the government job that he wanted. Prior to this, since the presidency of Andrew Jackson back in the early 1800s, there had been observed what we call the spoils system of government positions. In other words, people were put into positions not necessarily based off of their merit or their skill set, but because they were friends with the person who appointed them, or they donated a lot of money to the political party. And Jackson had argued that this would promote putting more everyday Americans into government jobs rather than this being concentrated into the handful of a small elite. But again, it just introduced more levels of political corruption. So the Civil Service Act of 1883 established a bureaucracy at the federal level based on merit. By requiring all applicants for certain government positions to pass a standard exam in order to qualify for government jobs, therefore minimizing the element of political patronage. And then the last major stab at reform during the Gilded Age is the Sherman Antitrust Act, passed in 1890. The Sherman Antitrust Act on paper looked like it was going to be a game changer. It was designed to prevent monopolies. Particularly, the language of the Sherman Antitrust Act made it sound like it was going to be used to go after any corporation that restricted fair competition. The problem with the Sherman Antitrust Act is it's not used as intended for its first decade or so in existence. The Sherman Antitrust Act repeatedly during the 1890s is not used against monopolies, but instead against labor unions. So there's not really the political will yet to use the Sherman Antitrust Act for its original intended purpose of breaking up large corporate monopolies until we get the arrival of President Theodore Roosevelt into office in the early 1900s, and then we'll finally start to see the Sherman Antitrust Act being used for its intended purpose. So the Gilded Age, just to recap, is a time of great prosperity for a few and a struggle with poverty for the vast majority of Americans. It's a time when the economy has very great highs, but also very great lows. It's a time of technological innovation. It's a time of a truly national economy. And unfortunately, this time period is not one marked by widespread commitment to reform or to addressing social problems. That commitment to reform is going to be left to the next major period in American history, the Progressive Era from 1900 to 1920, but more on that later. Thank you so much for tuning in. I'm Dr. S. Mocker.